Hello and welcome to the agenda. I am Ajay Kaul. In this program today, we will be discussing about India's new strategic paradigm. We just received 5 Rafale fighter aircraft from France. These 5 aircraft are part of a deal for procurement of 36 such jets by 2022. It's after 36 years that India has acquired a fighter plane from France. The last one was Mirage 2000, inducted in 1984. Why did it take so long for procuring a weapon system from France, which has been truly an all-weather friend of India? Does India now realize that it has ignored France for too long, despite France being a sincere supporter of India all through? I may point out here that after the 1998 Pokhran nuclear tests conducted by India, all major powers had imposed sanctions on India except France. It was the only country which openly defended India. Today in the agenda, we will discuss this and other aspects related to India's strategic paradigm with veteran diplomat Dr. Deepak Vohra. But before we start the discussion, let's have a look at this small report.
When 5 Rafale fighter planes landed at Ambala Air Base, it not only meant boosting Indian military capabilities, but also spoke volumes about India's strategic moves. It was after 36 years that India has procured a fighter plane from France, despite France being an all-weather friend of India in the true sense. India's relations with France have remained understated and not utilized to the potential that exists. But the procurement of Rafale planes indicates that India is no longer going to be over-dependent on Russia for its military hardware. This hints at a paradigm shift in India's strategic calculations. France, a major world power, has stood by India through thick and thin and worked for safeguarding India's interests, including at the UN Security Council, of which it is a permanent member with veto power. It has also supported India at all international fora in raising voice against Pakistan-sponsored terrorism. When India conducted nuclear tests in May 1998, France was the only major power which stood by India and refused to impose sanctions despite pressure from the US and others. A year later, when India fell short of ammunition for French-made Mirage 2000 fighter planes during the Kargil conflict, France sent emergency supplies to ensure that the Indian Air Force could deliver a deadly blow to the Pakistani troops. The Mirage 2000 fighter aircraft, which played a key role in the defeat of Pakistan in Kargil, had been inducted in the Indian Air Force in 1984. However, even before the Mirage planes came, French military machines were doing yeoman service for the Indian Armed Forces. Indo-French military ties actually began just 7 years after independence. Over 100 master fighter jets from France that joined the Indian Air Force were able to match the American starfighters in dogfights during the 1965 Indo-Pak War. Not only in the military field, France has helped India even in the civil nuclear field. When Tarapur atomic plants fell short of fuel some decades back, France was forthcoming in sending the supplies urgently, thus saving these units from drying up. Now is the time to nurture relations with France optimally and take the ties to newer heights. Bureau Report.
Let's welcome our special guest, Dr. Deepak Vohra. Welcome to the program, sir.
Thank you very much. Always a pleasure to interact with and learn from Asia's finest and smartest journalist. His name is Ajay Kaul. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the compliment. So let me ask the first question is like it's after decades, almost 4 decades, that India has procured a weapon system like a fighter jet from France. How do you see this situation? Because since France has been an all-weather friend all through.
You're absolutely right. You're spot on when you said that they have been our most consistent friends. But for some reason, particularly as far as media attention is concerned, this relationship between India and France remained under the radar. So if you give me a moment, I'd just like to go very quickly back into the history of our relationship. 350 years ago, the French first came messing around in India. They built their first warehouse, interestingly, in Surat. And then, of course, in the famous Battle of Plassey in 1975, that scoundrel Robert Clive defeated the Nawab of Bengal. The French were supporting the Nawab. And a few years later came the Battle of Vandavasi, which the French called, which the British called the Battle of Vandiwash, which was goodbye to the French. Interestingly, I could never remember the names of the commanders of the two sides when I was learning this in school. So my teacher used to tell us that the French Lallu, his name was Delali, was beaten by the British Coot. The fellow's name was actually Coot. And then I rush forward to the post-independence period, 1954. Don't forget, sir, that France returned very quietly its colonies to us, Puducherry, Chandanago, Yunnan, Mahe, etc. Perhaps they were smarting under the defeat in the middle of 1954 by the Vietnamese in Dien Phu, but they gave it to us. The Portuguese didn't. And 7 years later, we had to go do a military operation to take back Goa. Now, France in 1960 also became the fourth country to independently test a domestically made nuclear weapon, possibly with Israeli support. You've talked about weapons from France. Our very first fighter aircraft, the Ouragan, which we used to call the Tufani, came to us from the same company, sir, Dassault Aviation, and those planes made 12 halts on their flight from France to India, including one in Karachi. We used the Tufani to plaster the Portuguese in Goa in 1961. Then in the mid-50s came the Mystiers that we used in the 65 and 71 ops. And of course, then we began production of the Cheetah and the Alouette and the Chetak and so on, the helicopters in the 60s. Then, sir, in 81, you remember the deep penetration strike aircraft, the Jaguars? Those were actually Anglo-French, but we got them. And then we started making the guided anti-tank missiles. Then, sir, the very, very important thing, it was in 85, we got the Mirage 2000. We called it the Vajra. It was our first fly-by-wire fighter in our Air Force. Oh, they took our relief supplies to Jaffna. They flew over the Maldives to thwart the coup attempt. They were the aircraft we used to drop smart bombs in Kargil and plaster the Pakistanis over there, etc., etc. They did a lot of work for us. And of course, as you know, that we used them in the Balakot anti-terror strike also. In 2006, the Scorpion submarines, we started making them in India. And the first one was commissioned only 2 years ago. You know, 2018, sir, there's something that I, possibly not well known, you would know it. France actually gifted us 31 Jaguar airframes, gifted them to us so that we could replace the aging airframes of the older ones. The Brits also gave us 2, but they sold it to us, reminding me of what the late 18th century French revolutionary Bertrand Barrère had said, that England is a nation of shopkeepers. It doesn't matter what was going on there. But in any case, you know, now the Rafale has come, sir, 2020. The order was placed 4 years ago. You're absolutely right. There was a delay. Rafale means gust of wind.
Yeah.
And it's a gust of wind. हम कहते हैं ना हमारे लिए हवा का झोंका है, पर दुश्मन के लिए एक lightning की strike है. And France also gave us some missile systems for these aircraft from its own reserves. 1998, you said rightly, we had this strategic partnership agreement. France never sanctioned India when the rest of the world, the Western countries, imposed sanctions after, well, first was 1974 after our nuclear test. They stopped supplying fuel, the Americans, for Tarapur. The French said, don't worry, buddy, we'll do it. Similarly, after our nuclear test, everybody, small countries, New Zealand, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland used to give us lectures on nuclear testing and all. We got sick and tired of them, said we won't take any aid from you, forget about it, good boy. And then, you know, last year, sir, just a few months ago, December 2019, France announced that it would be doing joint patrols with India. And I think it was 10 or 11 years ago, for the first time, Indian troops participated in the National Day of any country. It was in France. Yeah. So you're absolutely right. And thank you for bringing this above the radar so that people understand कि जब हम iron friend की बात करते हैं, the thing that the Pakistanis and the Chinese talk about Egypt, which is all nonsense. France truly has been an iron friend. Why? Because I believe that France, which had visions of being a great power, it was, one quarter of the world's surface were French colonies, etc., in Africa, in Asia, etc. They had these visions. They got clobbered in the Second World War, but then they wanted to take back their preeminent position, what they thought was preeminent. And in Asia, they realized that the budding power was India. That explains their interest in India. And we saw them as very, very sincere.
So, Dr. Vohra, you gave a detailed overview of France and its relations with India, but I have been tracking foreign affairs for some time, but I feel India has not nurtured its relationship with France too much, although France has been consistent and I guess the strongest supporter of India, whether it be at the UNSC or even at FATF or wherever you want, and they have been readily offering you weapon system, military systems with transfer of technology. I think they were the first country to offer transfer of technology, nuclear, be it nuclear field. How do you see this? Do you agree with this opinion?
Sir, you are absolutely correct. But we've had very close cooperation. We just haven't talked very much about it. I think that's what the French also wanted. We also preferred to keep it at a low key. Remember, sir, in 1999, when we were dropping those smart bombs on Kargil using the Vajra, the Mirage 2000, our first fly-by-wire fighters, the engineers from Dassault came very quietly and modified our aircraft to be able to carry the smart bomb. So we've had this consistent friendship and cooperation, but you are absolutely right that we haven't talked about it very much. I mean, take, for example, space cooperation, if you permit, sir. There was the 1981, I think we had if you remember, the famous Apple Ariane passenger payload experiment, which was an experimental communication satellite for ISRO launched from French Guyana. On a Ariane rocket. So that was, very interesting that even in space technology, they were helping us. Now, of course, we launch French satellites. Then civil nuclear cooperation. I mean, they gave us fuel when everybody else stopped doing it. Following the nuclear supply waiver group, which came to us in 2008, France was the first country to sign a civil cooperation agreement with us. They were supposed to help us build 6 atomic power plants at Jaitapur, each of 1650 megawatts. Whether it comes about or not, that's a different thing. Then missile technology control regime. France's support has always been consistent because they see India as a solid power and a solid partner.
So from taking off from there, so that's what again I insist that India has not utilized that relationship or France's friendship offer or maybe more on the plate. As you talked about Jaitapur, when we offered our opened our nuclear business, I think French were the first to come in and really meant business and started it. While Americans and Russians are still wondering what to do and where to do it, isn't it?
Absolutely right. You have to say this to the French, that they might have lost their empire or whatever. They still, a small example, sir, they are very smart. Look at it. France doesn't have one drop of uranium, but 75% of their electricity is nuclear energy. Look at, they control the mines in Mali, Mauritania, wherever. Doesn't have a drop of oil, yet Total is the world's 3rd largest oil exploration company. So they're very smart in terms of technology. And by the way, these submarines were made by a company called DCNS, if I'm not mistaken, now called Naval Group. It's a 400-year-old naval company in France. They enabled France to build a navy and rule a quarter of the world. I mean, France has a history of military effectiveness, military technology, which we are now taking advantage of. There have been ups and downs, so we got distracted during the Cold War. We were with the Soviet Union, whatever the reasons. I'm not being critical or supportive. And then with the United States, etc. But under the radar, very quietly, we have been strengthening our relationship with France. And you know this better than I do, sir.
So, as you said, that now we have started taking advantage of French technology and their power, whatever their equipment, their prowess is. So, is that a shift in the Indian strategic paradigm that comes to the time?
I would say that our strategic paradigm, if that's the right word, has always been friendship with all and malice towards none. Basically, the idea was that whoever could respond to our needs at a particular time should do it. People have criticized us at one time.
But I may interrupt you here, but that's what I again come back to the same thing. French have been ready to help us every time and everywhere, but we have not taken advantage. I again come to that point. We
Yeah,
have been over dependent on Russia and looking out to USA, but ignoring maybe kind of France.
I entirely agree with what you are saying, sir. The perception is that we haven't given them the kind of attention that we should have. But this has served us well, sir, because it has enabled both sides to resist any kind of extraneous pressure. I mean, when they resumed supplies to Tarapur, I know I was already in the service, the Americans were pretty mad about it, saying, listen, we've stopped it. Why are you doing it? And again, after our nuclear tests in the late 90s, the French just told the rest of the developed world that you guys go fly a kite. We love India and we are going to give them what they want. And we appreciate that. But had we highlighted that, perhaps they would have come under much greater pressure. So sometimes, sir, in diplomacy and in international affairs, a low-key approach can be useful. Where, of course, now it's no longer low-key, because the Rafales came there. But there's one thing that you would need to understand also with the Rafale, sir. What they've given us is the top of the line Rafale. It's not what they've given the Egyptians and the Qataris. It's what they use themselves. And from their own war reserves, they provided us some of the missiles that the Rafales are going to be on.
If we compare it with maybe Russia, when they gave us Sukhois, they were kind of outdated. When they gave us in 90s, they were of 80s version. So, and we had treated Russia as our best friend.
You know, you can choose your friends, but then your friend has to choose you, so to speak. I mean, he decides what he wants to give you. When you're in a position where you need to get something from somebody, it depends on his goodwill.
No, my point is we have been over dependent on Soviet Union or Russia for maybe all these decades. Maybe last one decade we have not maybe diluted that over dependence. So how do you see that?
You're absolutely right. But now we've diversified. Now it's well known. If you try and check what our latest acquisitions in the last decade or in the last 5 years, particularly, as you've rightly pointed out, our main suppliers are Israel, the United States, we've got France, we've got even Sweden, we've got a few other countries that are doing it. So the dependence on the successor of the Soviet Union, which is the Russian Federation, has correspondingly gone down. At the same time, sir, they stood by us. So you can't suddenly break it. You know, you never know. It's always a question of trying out over a period of time. But yes, the movement is clear. The movement is clear.
I am not saying you just break it. I am saying let us not be over dependent. Let us explore other.
Nobody can disagree with that. They're absolutely right. So if I take a moment, may I also talk about the rest of the world. America in particular went about arming Pakistan, knowing that when they gave them weapons, they said, oh, these are going to be used.
I was coming to America also, but maybe it's so
they gave weapons to Pakistan.
So since you want to talk about America, let me ask about America. America has made us military partner and strategic partner and all that. How reliable is it? Because it sometimes switches the relationship on and sometimes switches it off according to its whims.
You know, when you are doing a tango with the only hyperpower in the world, there are certain risks involved. And we judge by experience. What have we seen them do in the past few years? Based on that, I would say that there is a paradigm shift on their side, not on ours. When they supplied weapons to Pakistan after 65, 71, etc., they told us, oh, these are meant to be used against the Soviet Union, not against you fellows. So we said, we don't know that you have the capability to manufacture weapons that fire in only one direction. I mean, they can be turned around to be used against us, and they were. France, on the other hand, I mean, if you permit, sir, that till the 1990s, they kept their options open between India and Pakistan. You know, 76, they agreed to supply a nuclear reprocessing, plutonium reprocessing plant to Pakistan. We opposed it tooth and nail. I was then posted in our mission in Paris, and we fought like hell. It was subsequently, because of American pressure, cancelled. Then in the 1990s, you had the Karachi scandal. You remember that, sir? On the Scorpions. I mean, Benazir Bhutto lost her second term in office because of that. Because the French company then, I believe it was DCNS again, that they were, which is now called Group Naval, on the naval group, they had bribed some lobbyists in France and in Pakistan, etc., etc. In the 1990s, sir, bribing lobbyists in France was not an offense. It was only after France signed the OECD Convention against bribery of foreign public officials
that was perhaps a sell tactic. to bribe and get into, isn't it?
But after they signed the OECD convention, they became very, very sensitive. You know, in 2011, this French company, I visited their headquarters, major defense contractor called Société Thales. In English, you would say Thales. These guys paid almost $600 million to Taiwan for some ships that they had sold by bribing Taiwanese officials and padding the price. $600 million they had to pay to the government of Taiwan. And then Airbus, sir, you know, just this year, 2020, they've had to pay $4 billion to France, to England, to America for bribing officials in 20 countries. Fortunately, not in India. So the French are very, very sensitive to bribery. And if I may say so, sir, the delay perhaps in the arrival of the Rafales to India was precisely because the French, so my French friends told me, were a little concerned with all the allegations that were being made by interested people in India that money had changed hands for the Rafale to come here. The French, sir, and I can say this with total confidence, after they signed that OECD convention, they are not in the business of bribing. You know why I say that? 4 years ago, a Turkish company is upgrading 3 Augusta-class missiles supplied by DCNS, the naval group, to Pakistan. The French refused to do it because the Pakistanis, as always, said, you know, thank you very much for upgrading the missiles, but ab mera kya hoga, Kalia? The French said, we are not in that business anymore. So they got the Turks to do it, and the Turks, of course, are very open to doing all these funny things. So that's something that indicates to you that the French have become very, very tough about it. In Transparency International's ranking, they used to be pretty low, but they've gone up now. They're not in the business of bribery anymore. So that's what I believe. And therefore, I think that if we are strengthening our relationship, it's coming out into the open. That's a very good thing, sir.
So if we talk about the new paradigm shift, I'll talk about Israel, about which we have been shy for decades. Now we are trying to open, or we have been opening up over the last 2 decades rather. So how do you see, again, that relationship is under nurtured, and there is lot of possibilities. There are a lot of possibilities, particularly in defense sector, strategic sector, and other sectors also.
You know, it's fascinating. I've seen a report of a conversation between former Prime Minister of Israel when she was still alive, Golda Meir, and an Indian Prime Minister. They met privately somewhere. And the Indian Prime Minister then said, you know, we've been wanting to come to Israel for a while. And she responded, we were waiting for you, but you never came. A very telling comment that our hearts have always been, the Israelis feel, with India. I mean, we are the only country in the history of world Jewry where Jews were never persecuted. The Israelis know this. They've made films about this. So they wanted to make friends with us. We are now reciprocating in ample measure. Of course, business is business, and they will sell their weapons to us, and we'll buy them. But I believe, sir, now we have the maturity and expertise to realize who our real friends are and whose weapons systems we can depend on. So I would say, sir, that I'm much more hopeful today than I would have been perhaps 10 or 15 years ago.
No, they of course want to sell their weapons, and we also desperately need such military systems like sensors, or maybe their reconnaissance aircraft, or maybe their snipers, their other weapons.
Even the helmets in the Rafale, which our pilots will use, are Israeli.
So on the LOC, which is very hot, always hot, we need so much of their systems to guard against infiltration and other activities, isn't it?
They are doing it, sir. We are getting it from them, and they are not giving it to either of the other 2 fellows who are challenging us at this time, according to what we know. They are not giving them their best stuff. They are giving it to us. Sir, nobody sees India as a cheat or a thug or a rival or a nuclear proliferator. They see China and Pakistan as this, and they don't wish to trust them with their state-of-the-art technologies. The Chinese will promptly copy it and reverse engineer it. It's not going to work, sir. I mean, a copy might be a tribute to the original, but it's flattering to the original, but that's not innovation, sir. Whereas in our system, as you have seen now with the new defense policy and so on, we are looking to Atmanirbhar Bharat. We are asking people to make in India, to innovate in India, sir. I believe the Israelis will help us in this substantially, as will the French. And from time to time, as you said, so will the Americans and possibly the Russians.
So your last comment, since you said that nobody considers India as a thug. So is India ready to accept that or go out and take all advantages of that?
Oh, absolutely, sir. You can see what is happening. You know, there's a Major General of the PLA, the People Liberation Army Air Force, and he did an interview with South China Morning Post 2 months ago, and I read it with great interest, in which he has said that, all right, we've been throwing all this money around, China has, not one country has supported us against American pressure on us. Because everybody thinks we throw money for our own self-interest. His words, not mine. And the implication was that everybody thinks we are cheats. India is not, sir. We've proved this time and again. I believe we are now reaping full advantage of our reputation, which is solid and sterling reputation, sir.
Thank you so much for participating in this debate. Always a pleasure to have you on this program. This is all in the agenda today. Thanks for watching. I will be back with another important topic tomorrow. Till then, goodbye.